Hello out there, all you history fans, and welcome to our very last lesson on the Industrial Revolution using the Industrial Revolution teaching and learning website resources. Today we're under lesson 2 of the impacts of society tab, so the impacts of the Industrial Revolution on society and the human race. And today we are looking at socialism and other impacts of the Industrial Revolution. So we're looking at, in particular, the movement of socialism that was created, that was born out of the harsh working conditions that people faced. And then we're looking at some of the other long and short-term impacts from last lesson. So to begin with, your learning intention and success criteria. So by the end of this lesson, you need to know the impacts of the Industrial Revolution on society. And by the end of the lesson, you need to be able to explain how society changed due to the Industrial Revolution. So there's a bit to unpack there. So just a bit of a background of socialism and the Industrial Revolution. So socialism is a philosophy that calls for the public ownership and control of property and natural resources instead of private ownership. So rather, everything is owned by everyone rather than everything owned by private individual people. This way of thinking was brought about by the harsh working conditions and the exploitation of workers during the Industrial Revolution. Socialist views led the way to overthrow laissez-faire capitalism, which ran rampant during the Industrial Revolution. The first person we need to look at is Karl Marx, and as your study of history continues, you will no doubt come across this man's work again. So Karl Marx suggested socialist ideas in his book, The Communist Manifesto, where he discussed the exploitation of workers and children in the workplace. He expresses socialist views for a more equitable society where there is no class division. And of course, these beliefs led to the communist movement as well. The next person we need to have a look at to understand socialism as a result of the Industrial Revolution is Robert Owen. And he's probably the father of socialism during the end of the Industrial Revolution. So Robert Owen is perhaps the most well-known socialist during the Industrial Revolution. I just had a bit of a spoiler for that. Owen ran a cotton factory at a place called New Lanark. His business was successful because he prioritised the well-being of his employees. So instead of sending them to work for no amount of money pretty much and forcing them to work in the harshest and foulest working conditions, he actually paid them well, gave them decent hours and a decent place to work. And they were happier, so they were successful. Owen paid his employees good wages while providing them with healthcare and education benefits. So again, I've spoiled myself a bit again. Robert Owen proved that businesses could be successful without exploiting their workers by subjecting them to harsh working conditions and long shifts for little pay. And you can learn a bit more about him in your first task, this video on Robert Owen and New Lanark. So just go ahead and watch this video here and write down 3 facts from the video in your book. Guys, the next task here is some comprehension questions and impacts of the Industrial Revolution. So if you go ahead and click on the History Crunch website here, you'll find the answers to all of these questions that you can go ahead and find now. I am going to run through task 3, the sources, with you though. So we'll do these ones together. So source 1 we'll have a look at now is a poster created by the Conservative Party in 1909 of socialism represented as a beast shaking Britain. So this was a very political poster. So is it a primary or secondary source? Why? Well, it was created during the Industrial Revolution and it reveals people's first-hand thoughts about the time they were living in, so it is a primary source. Who created the source? We've got the Conservative Party. When was it created? We've got 1909. Number 4, observe the source. How did the Conservative Party in Britain view the socialist movement? Well, they didn't like it. They also wanted to communicate that it was threatening and dangerous to the way of life that existed for a good 100, 200 years. Number 5, what was the Conservative Party's reason for making this poster? What is the purpose of this source? So their purpose for making this source is to scare people into what could be the consequences of socialism. So if we move to a more socialist society instead of a very extreme laissez-faire capitalist society, it could be really threatening. It's very dangerous and very scary. So it was really a scare tactic to try and keep society the way it was. Number 6, what class of people in Britain would have supported this poster? So of course the working class. So the working class were the people who suffered during the Industrial Revolution, so they were the ones who most wanted things to change and become more socialist. So that's source 1. Let's have a look at source 2 now. So source 2 is a graph and it's about CO2 emissions in the United Kingdom between the years of 1751 to 1912. Number 1, is this a primary or secondary source, and why? Well, it is a secondary source. It's data collected from many years, from just shy of 200 years, so it is a secondary source, so it's collected over a long time. And it was also finalised, this graph was finalised long after the Industrial Revolution ended. So it's a secondary source. Who created the source? Well, it says here the source is by Global Carbon Project. Now, is this source biased? Why not? So if you want to know what bias is, you can click on this link there for you and read what's in the purple here. So bias is when the creator's perspective is so strongly for or against something that the information in the source is clearly unbalanced or prejudiced. All sources contain some degree of bias, but it's not always possible to detect. If you cannot detect bias, it's described as a balanced source. So this one is a balanced source. It doesn't have any real emotive language in it. And it says here that all sources have a little bit of bias, even a tiny bit, So this one is made by the Global Carbon Project. Of course, they're going to want to look at the dramatic rates of CO2 emissions, but this is a balanced source. So it's not very biased at all. What was the level of carbon emissions in 1780? So we'll go here. So go 1 over to 1780. There we go. So we've got 15.06 trillion tonnes, which is still quite a lot when you think about it. Also, just going back to question 3 and the link between question 3 and 4, this is data. So the data doesn't lie, they're numbers, these are facts. So again, it's balanced. Now we need to the level of carbon emissions in 1850. We've got 122.6 million tonnes. What was the level of carbon emissions in 1880 exactly? 297.12 million tonnes. Now, looking at the last 3 questions, and just looking at the graph, you can see it's going up. So describe the trend of carbon emissions from 1751 to 1912 and what specifically caused this. So, of course, it's on the up, it's increasing over time. Of course, the Industrial Revolution causes, with the burning of coal, the large amount of factories. That's why we have so many CO2 emissions that really start when the Industrial Revolution started. Source 3, we've got a cartoon drawn by Isaac Cruikshank in 1808 of Jenner and his 2 colleagues seeing off 3 anti-vaxxers. So, just looking at the source here, and you can zoom in. So we've got kind of these dead bodies from smallpox. So the title of this source is Vaccination Against Smallpox. And then pretty much talking about how they're banishing people who are anti-vaxxers from society. So this is a representation of that. So this is Jenner here, and he says, "Oh, brothers, suffer the life to gain, and not to overcome the contagion for your fellow creatures, and don't delight to plunge them and their families in the deepest distress by the untimely lot of their nearest and dearest relatives." So, meaning that these guys aren't being very sympathetic because they're putting other people's lives and their families' lives at risk as well. So they're like get out of the society, you're not much better than apes, really. We've also got this angel up here giving Jenner a little crown, saying that he is a preserver of the human race. Here we've got our 3 anti-vaxxers on their big knife. This one's carrying, it says, the curse of humankind. This one up here talks about how we'll be starved of our opinions, and this one here talks about, and those would communicate it so much more. And then this guy here agrees with these 2 guys, saying, I always ordered them to be constantly out in the air, but in order to spread the contagion. So it's saying how, to be immune against smallpox, there must be some natural resistance to it, and they're just go away. So very charged political cartoon. Is it a primary source or a secondary source? Why not? It is a primary source. It is made during the time of study, so of course it is a primary source. Who created the source? His name is Isaac Cruikshank. When was the source created? Is 1808. What disease is Jenner vaccinating against? He's vaccinating against smallpox is the vaccine, or the virus they're vaccinating against. What is happening in the cartoon? So these 3 gentlemen here, including Jenner, the creator of the vaccine, is seeing off and telling these people who are anti-vaxxers to go away. Why are there dead babies and children on the same side as the anti-vaxxers? So they're trying to say that there's all these like dead and infected people where they are because they're causing it. So by them not being vaccinated, they're causing the deaths of these people and the spread of smallpox. Number 7, what was Cruikshank's reason for drawing this cartoon? What is he trying to tell the audience? Well, he's trying to tell the audience that anti-vaxxers are not only spreading smallpox but causing people to die, and they should leave because they're causing people's deaths. How is this cartoon relevant today? Well, this cartoon is very relevant today because people still need to be vaccinated against really deadly viruses, and if you're not, you're putting other people at risk as well. So that is why this cartoon is relevant today. Number 4. Now, this is an extract from William Jones's 1919 book called The Lifetimes and Labours of Robert Owen. So going back to this guy here, and just going back down to the source. And this extract in particular, these 2 pages talk about his workers and his treatment of his workers at the factory at New Lanark. So, like any good historian, I'm going to read the source before we start answering the questions. So, in New Lanark, the quality of the goods supplied to the people was very inferior. So this is before he started. And the prices were very high. So the quality of the goods is poor, it's very bad, and it was very expensive, the prices were high. I arranged, says Owen, superior stores and shops from which to supply every article of ordinary daily consumption. He bought everything with ready money in the first markets and contracted for fuel, milk, and other articles produced in the neighbourhood, so as to secure all the advantages of a large ready money purchase. So pretty much he bought all the supplies and everything. He bought all the food and all the products. And also when it says articles here, he's talking about the actual like food items and grocery items. These articles were brought to the doors of the people and supplied to them at cost price, at a saving of 25% in the expenditure of their wages. By this arrangement alone, an improvement in health and comfort very soon became perceptible among them. So Owen bought all the grocery supplies and then sold it back to people at cost price, so what they actually cost, so not overly high prices. And that saved people around 25% of the money that they would spend on food and groceries, already having a benefit among them as well. Working men are ready enough to credit the well-intentioned action of employers when it is not accompanied by the conditions of counterbalance the proposed good. And so it was in New Lanark. So that's saying that these workers are happy with this deal because they're normally used to deals where they get counterbalanced or there's a consequence for the deal. The suspicion and distrust of the people gradually began to give way. Their new employer and manager had been 6 years among them, and in such a relationship, shut in, as it were, from the rest of the world in the seclusion of the Lanark Valley, the feelings of people towards each other soon became known. Robert Owen discovered that he was rapidly growing into favour with the workers at the mills. The event by which he made a complete conquest of their goodwill occurred about this time, namely in the year 1806. So they're building up to telling the story, or Jones is building up to tell you the story of his greatest deed he did for his workers. So in this year, the United States, in consequence of diplomatic differences, placed an embargo on the export of cotton to Great Britain. So pretty much America told Britain they weren't going to trade with them anymore because Britain and France didn't like each other at this stage, and they kept putting pressure on America, and in particular American ships, to get involved in their political differences. So the United States said, no, we're not putting ships in your waters, we're not going to trade you cotton. So as a natural consequence, the prices of raw cotton advanced so as to greatly cripple the manufacturers in the working of their mills. So you can't run a textile factory without cotton. Whenever cost of production through any cause runs unnaturally high, the manufacturer has to calculate very narrowly whether it is better to make for a future market at the risk of sudden reductions of price or to partially or wholly stop his mill. So this is saying when this sort of thing normally happens, when you've got a factory and there's actually nothing to do, you can either stop and fire all your workers, or you can pay them even less. In this case, as in all other similar cases, some acted on one policy and some on another. So people chose one of those two options. The dilemma is a very serious one, particularly where work is carried on in out-of-the-way places. To continue working means heavy purchases of raw materials as well as payment of wages. To stop occasions the disorganisation and the establishment by the dispersion of the people who are compelled to go elsewhere in search for employment. So that means if a factory shuts down, people are going to go looking for work, and that can cause problems too, when a lot of people leave at once. And the misery communities of men suffer is great when such a policy has to be pursued. The thought of the privations of the people weighed heavily on Robert Owen's mind, and though he determined on the stopping of the works as the safest course to be pursued for himself and his partners, he decided to pay full wages to the people for simply attending the machinery and keeping it in good working condition. So Robert Owen decided to close the factory but still pay his workers, even if their only task was to check the machinery to make sure it still worked. He did this for nearly 4 months, which has still got quite a lot of time, and during that time paid £7,000 to workers without 1 penny being deducted from their wages. So he still paid them their full wages so they could keep their jobs. This proceeding, he says, won him the confidence and the hearts of the whole of the population. From that time forward, they went confidently with him and whatever he proposed, so that he had no obstruction in doing whatever his partners permitted him to undertake. So they trust him after this. Right, let's get stuck into these questions now. We've read those 2 pages. So number 1, is this a primary or secondary source? Why? Well, it's a secondary source because Jones wrote this in 1919. If you scroll back up here, this is long after Robert Owen died. So this must be a secondary source. However, there does seem to be a quote from Owen here. So that little snippet could be a primary source upon further research, but it's a secondary source. It was made a long time after Owen died. Number 2, who created the source? His name is William Cairns Jones. That's his book. When was it created? It was 1919. It's good information to know before we dive into these questions. So number 4, according to Jones, what type of person was Robert Owen? Well, it seems like he was incredibly generous and really selfless as well, by paying his workers wages even when there was no work so that they could keep their jobs, and then buying food for them and then selling it back to them cheaply. So he's very generous and very selfless. Number 5, what were the 2 things wrong with the food and clothes people had to buy in New Lanark before Owen began to help the workers? So if you go back up here, it says the quality of the goods was very inferior or very low, and the prices of these goods was very high. So that is your answer for number 5. Number 6, how did Owen fix this problem? We read this in this paragraph here. It talks about how he bought all the goods and then went to their houses, actually went like to their doorsteps and then sold it back to them at a cost saving of 25%. So he sold it back to them cheaper. How did this improve the lives of families in New Lanark? It says here, it improved their health and comfort. So we can tell it improved their whole livelihood. In particular, they were not spending as much money on food. The food quality was also better as well. Number 8, what did the US stop Britain from getting in 1806? So it's cotton. It says that there. They stopped trading cotton with them. What impact would this have on Owen's manufacturing business and his workers? Well, you can't run a textile factory without any cotton. So that's the answer for number 9. So the factory would have to shut down. Number 10, how did Owen prevent his workers from losing their jobs? Well, on this page here, we get told the story of how he paid their shifts for, question 11, 4 months. And he paid £7,000 of his own money in total just so they could keep their jobs. So he paid their wages for them and he did it for 4 months. Number 12, what impact did this gesture have on the people at New Lanark? What did Robert win? So it says here that he won the confidence and the hearts of the whole population. So the people trusted him after this and they believed in him. So guys, that is your very last lesson on the Industrial Revolution. Thank you for your engagement in this unit. It's been a heck of a ride. Make sure you go ahead and subscribe if you want to stay up to date with any new lessons I make in existing websites like this one or any new websites. Thank you guys.